At 2:52 p.m., the room still believed titles outranked results. At 2:58, a single sentence shifted the air. He had Wharton School credentials. She had numbers no one else could stabilize. They chose prestige. She chose silence. By 3 p.m., she closed her laptop with surgical calm, as if ending a meeting that no longer required her presence. No argument, no scene, just absence, precise, deliberate. At 3:03, Slack threads started multiplying. At 3:05, dashboards began to flicker. At 3:07, the first message reached the CFO, and that's when the question changed. Not who decides, but what just broke. At 2:41 p.m., the conference room carried that familiar executive stillness, the kind that looks calm but hums with quiet hierarchy. Glass walls, muted city reflections, polished table surfaces reflecting faces that rarely get interrupted. She sat halfway down the table, not at the head, not near the screen, exactly where people assume your support, not strategy. Across from her, the VP leaned back with the relaxed certainty of someone who doesn't expect resistance. He tapped a pen once, then twice. A small signal that he was about to close the discussion, not continue it. "He has a Wharton School MBA," he said, nodding toward the new hire. "He'll take over the decision." There it was. Not an argument, not even a justification, just a credential, placed on the table like a final card. No one spoke. The new hire smiled politely, controlled, rehearsed confidence. He hadn't built anything here yet, but he didn't need to. The room had already decided for him. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she glanced at the screen. Numbers, forecasts, projections she had personally rebuilt over the past 9 months, quietly correcting assumptions no one else had noticed, tightening leaks that had been written off as market noise. She knew those models the way a pilot knows turbulence before it hits, and she also knew something else. The system didn't break loudly. It failed gradually, then all at once. "All right," she said softly. Not defensive, not challenging, just final. That was the moment a few people shifted in their chairs, though they couldn't explain why. There was no tension in her voice, but there was a precision to it, like a door closing somewhere you couldn't see. The VP nodded, satisfied. Decision made. Meeting concluded. But she didn't reach for her notes, didn't open another slide. Instead, she closed her laptop. The sound was quiet, too quiet. But in that room, it cut sharper than any raised voice. "I'll step out," she added. No one stopped her. That was the mistake. At 2:56 p.m., she walked past the open office floor. Conversations blurred into background noise. Screens glowed with dashboards that still held together, for now. At 2:58, she sent one message. Short, targeted. No explanation attached. At 2:59, she logged out. No dramatic exit. No last look back. Just a clean disconnect. The kind that suggests planning, not emotion. Inside the conference room, the VP had already moved on. "Let's proceed," he said, turning to the new hire. "Walk us through your approach." The presentation started smoothly. Slides advanced. Assumptions sounded reasonable, at least on the surface, the kind of logic that works when nothing unexpected happens. At 3:02 p.m., someone refreshed a dashboard. At 3:03, a number lagged. At 3:04, another metric stopped updating. "Is that normal?" someone asked. No one answered immediately. The new hire paused mid-sentence, just briefly, but enough. At 3:05, Slack notifications began stacking. At 3:06, the first call came in from operations, and suddenly the room wasn't calm anymore. It wasn't loud either. Worse, it was uncertain. The VP frowned, tapping the table again, this time faster. "Check the pipeline," he said. Someone already had. And that's when the silence changed its texture. Because this wasn't a glitch. This was a dependency. And they had just let it walk out at 2:56 p.m. At 3:07, an email hit the CFO's inbox. Subject line: Talent exposure risk. Immediate review. Attachment: a report no one in that room had ever seen before, except her. And it didn't just show numbers. It showed what happens when the person behind them is no longer there. Back in the conference room, no one mentioned her name. Not yet. But every screen in that room had already started asking the same question. Just silently. Just too late. At 3:08 p.m., the room stopped pretending. The slides were still on the screen, frozen mid-sentence, but no one was reading them anymore. The narrative had collapsed, not dramatically, not with noise, but with that precise, quiet disintegration that only happens when something critical is missing. "Why is the pipeline delayed?" the VP asked. Not loudly, not aggressively, just fast. Too fast. "Data sync isn't completing," someone replied, already refreshing the dashboard again, as if repetition might restore control. "It's stuck." Stuck where? No immediate answer, because the answer wasn't technical, it was structural. At 3:09 p.m., the new hire leaned forward, scrolling through access panels, permissions, logs, the visible surface of a system he had just inherited. "It looks like a permissions cascade," he said, choosing words carefully. "We might need elevated access to..." "To what?" the VP cut in. A pause. And in that pause, something uncomfortable surfaced. "I don't have full visibility yet." That sentence landed heavier than it should have, because in that room, visibility was supposed to come with authority, and he had just admitted he had one without the other. At 3:10 p.m., another notification, then another. Operations flagged discrepancies. Finance flagged delays. One region reported missing updates entirely. Not broken, just not moving. Like a system waiting for a signal that wasn't coming anymore. "She had access to this?" someone asked, too casually. No one answered directly, but several people stopped typing. At 3:11 p.m., the VP exhaled sharply, leaning back again, but this time without the earlier confidence. He looked at the screen, then at the team, then briefly at the empty chair she had left behind. "Fix it," he said. Two simple words, but they carried a new tone now, less directive, more uncertain. At 3:12 p.m., the first real problem surfaced. "We can't replicate the model adjustments," someone from analytics said. "They're not fully documented." "Not documented?" the VP repeated. "They are partially documented, but the logic layers," a hesitation. "They're customized." Customized. That word echoed differently. Not a flaw, not a shortcut, a dependency. At 3:13 p.m., the new hire stopped scrolling. "I can rebuild it," he said quickly, "but it'll take time." "How much time?" Another pause. "Best case, days. Days." In a system that recalculated every hour, that's when the room finally aligned on the same realization, not through discussion, but through silence. They hadn't just reassigned a role, they had removed a stabilizer. At 3:14 p.m., the VP stood up. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to break the illusion that this was still under control. "Call her." No one moved immediately, because suddenly it wasn't obvious who should, or how. At 3:15 p.m., someone opened her contact, hovered, closed it, opened Slack instead, typed, deleted, typed again. No one wanted to be the first to write a message that sounded like a reversal. Across the table, the new hire stared at the system logs again, but slower now, more careful, because what he was looking at wasn't just code or data, it was intent, and it was written in a way that assumed continuity, not replacement. At 3:16 p.m., the CFO replied, short, direct, no greeting. "Explain the $35 million exposure." The email was forwarded into the room almost instantly. No commentary, no interpretation, just the question. And suddenly, the hierarchy inverted, because titles don't answer numbers. Results do. The VP looked at the screen again, then at the empty chair, then back at the team. "Get her back," he said. This time, no one misunderstood the tone. But outside that room, time was already moving in a different direction, because at 3 p.m. she hadn't just left the meeting, she had exited the system. Cleanly, completely, intentionally. And now the question wasn't whether they could fix it was whether she would come back to fix it for them. Somewhere between 3:16 and 3:17, the first message finally went out. Carefully worded, neutral tone, no admission of urgency, but the delay had already said everything. Seen? No reply. And that was the moment the room understood something they hadn't accounted for. Control isn't what you assign, it's what you can't replace. If you've ever seen a decision made on titles instead of results, you already know how this ends. Subscribe now, because in the next chapter, one response, or silence, will redefine leverage, contracts, and who actually holds control when everything starts to slip. And pay attention to the timing, because what happens next doesn't take hours, it takes minutes. At 3:18 p.m., the second message went out, shorter, less neutral, no pretense this time. Can we talk? No reply. Inside the conference room, the air had shifted from uncertainty to exposure. Laptops were open, but no one was presenting anymore. Everyone was scanning, logs, threads, fragments of context, trying to reconstruct something that had never been fully handed over. At 3:19, Finance sent a follow-up. Variance increasing, confirm mitigation. The word mitigation lingered longer than it should have, because mitigation assumes control, and control at that moment was theoretical. She must have left documentation, someone said almost defensively. She did, another replied, but not the full decision logic, not the reasoning. Not the sequence, not the why behind the adjustments, only outcomes. At 3:20 p.m., the new hire finally stopped typing. This isn't just a model, he said quietly. It's layered dependencies, timing-based overrides, manual checkpoints that aren't visible unless you know where to look. A pause. It's not broken, he added. It's incomplete without her. That sentence didn't echo. It settled. At 3:21 p.m., the VP checked his phone. No response. He didn't show it, but his posture changed, just slightly, enough for the room to notice. Authority was still there. Certainty wasn't. Call her, he said again. This time someone did. It rang. Once, twice, then voicemail. No interruption, no decline, just absence. At 3:22 p.m., operations escalated. Regional delays confirmed. Impact spreading. The message was concise, but the implication wasn't, because systems don't wait for clarity. They continue, with or without it. At 3:23 p.m., the CFO sent another message, not a question this time, a directive. Provide recovery timeline, now. The email was projected on the screen without comment, because there was nothing to add. The new hire exhaled slowly. If I start rebuilding from here, I can stabilize partial outputs in maybe 48 hours. 48? The VP repeated. No one reacted, because they all understood the real translation. 48 hours of exposure. 48 hours of compounding variance. 48 hours without the one person who had prevented exactly this. At 3:24 p.m., someone opened her last commit log. Time-stamped, clean, precise, no loose ends, no unfinished work. It didn't look like someone who left in frustration. It looked like someone who closed a loop. And that realization landed differently, because frustration leaves gaps. Preparation doesn't. At 3:25 p.m., the third message was drafted. Longer this time, more careful, more respectful, acknowledging value, indirectly but clearly. It sat unsent for a few seconds longer than necessary, then sent. Across the room, no one spoke, because everyone understood what had just happened. Not technically, structurally. The company had shifted from decision mode to request mode. At 3:26 p.m., the CFO called. Direct line. No buffer. The VP answered immediately. Yes, we're assessing. A pause, longer than comfortable. No, the system isn't down, it's degraded. Another pause. Yes, she was leading that layer. Silence from the other end. Then a single sentence. Then why is she not in the room? That question cut through everything else, because it wasn't about systems, it was about judgment. At 3:27 p.m., the call ended. The VP didn't sit down immediately. He looked at the empty chair again, this time longer, not searching, not evaluating, just recognizing. At 3:28 p.m., a notification appeared. Her name. Everyone saw it. No one spoke. The message was short, professional, neutral. Unavailable at the moment. That was all. No explanation, no emotion, no urgency. But embedded in that sentence was something far more precise than any report in that room. Control. Because she hadn't reacted, she had responded. On her terms. On her time. At 3:29 p.m., no one moved. No one typed. No one tried to reinterpret the situation anymore, because for the first time since 2:52 p.m., the room understood the full equation. They hadn't lost access. They had lost alignment. And alignment isn't restored with authority. It's negotiated. At 3:30 p.m., the room stopped searching for shortcuts. No one suggested quick fixes anymore. No one refreshed dashboards hoping the numbers would correct themselves out of habit. The illusion of control had fully dissolved, and what remained was procedural reality. Get legal, the VP said, not as escalation, as necessity. At 3:31 p.m., the third message was already marked seen. Still no reply. But this time the silence didn't feel passive. It felt calibrated. Legal joined within minutes, not physically, but through a call that immediately changed the tone of the room. Where earlier there had been urgency, now there was structure. Summarize, counsel said. No small talk, no context building. Just facts. The VP spoke faster than usual. Critical dependency, model ownership unclear, access fragmented, impact escalating. A pause. And the individual? Another pause. Unavailable. Silence on the line. Not confusion. Assessment. At 3:33 p.m., counsel responded. Was there a transition plan? Yes. Was it completed? Partially. Was authority reassigned before full knowledge transfer? No one answered immediately, because now the question wasn't rhetorical. Yes, the VP said finally. Another pause, longer this time, measured. Then, you don't have a technical issue? A beat. You have a governance issue. That sentence landed with more weight than any metric on the screen, because governance isn't fixed with access. It's defined by decisions. At 3:34 p.m., legal continued. If her work constitutes critical operational infrastructure, and if her role was effectively reduced or overridden without secured continuity, you may be exposed. Exposed how? Someone asked. Operationally, contractually, potentially financially. The CFO's earlier email didn't need to be referenced. It was already understood. At 3:35 p.m., the VP looked at the team. Different now, less directive, more aware. What's the fastest path to stabilization? No one answered immediately, because now everyone knew the answer. They just hadn't said it out loud yet. At 3:36 p.m., the new hire spoke, carefully. We can rebuild over time. A pause, but immediate stabilization requires her. There it was, clear, unavoidable, no framing left. At 3:37 p.m., legal cut in again. Then your priority isn't technical recovery. Another pause. It's engagement. The word shifted everything, because engagement implies consent, not authority. At 3:38 p.m., the VP picked up his phone, not to call, to think, which in that moment took longer, because the approach had changed. This was no longer about bringing someone back into a system. It was about re-entering a negotiation they had already lost once. At 3:39 p.m., a new message was drafted. Not short this time, not neutral, structured, acknowledging contribution, clarifying urgency, opening space, not demanding action. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. Sent. The room waited. No one pretended to work now, Because for the first time since the meeting began, everyone understood that the next move wasn't theirs. At 3:40 p.m., legal added one final point. If she responds, be precise. A pause. Do not frame this as assistance. Another pause. Frame it as terms. And just like that, the hierarchy rewrote itself. At 3:41 p.m., the notification appeared. Her name. Again. This time, no delay. No hesitation. The message was longer. Still calm, still controlled, but unmistakably different. I'm open to a conversation. Please route through formal terms. No emotion, no urgency, no reference to what had just happened. Just structure. At 3:42 p.m., no one spoke. Because everyone in that room understood exactly what that meant. She hadn't left the system. She had repositioned within it. And now every minute going forward would have a price. At 3:43 p.m., the room didn't move. Not because they didn't know what to do, because they finally understood what it would cost. Formal terms, the VP repeated quietly. Not as a question, as recognition. At 3:44 p.m., legal took control. Open a bridge, limit participants, define scope before contact, counsel said, already structuring the conversation that, minutes ago, no one believed they would need. No improvisation, no pressure tactics, no assumptions. Because this was no longer internal, this was negotiated. At 3:45 p.m., a clean thread was initiated. No Slack noise, no fragmented messages. Just one channel, one line of communication, her name at the top, and for the first time that day, not as an employee, as a counterparty. The VP didn't type. Legal did. Measured language. Controlled tone. No unnecessary words. Requesting immediate engagement to stabilize critical operational systems. Please advise availability and terms. Sent. At 3:46 p.m., the entire room watched a single screen. No one spoke, because every variable, financial, operational, reputational, had collapsed into one dependency. Response, seen. At 3:47 p.m., the reply arrived. Precise, structured, anticipated. I'm available under the following conditions: temporary advisory role, independent scope, defined hourly rate, immediate access reinstatement with documented authority, no unilateral decision overrides during engagement, formal review of prior changes before continuation. A pause. Then one final line. Engagement begins upon written confirmation. Silence, not shock. Clarity. At 3:48 p.m., the CFO joined the thread. No greeting. Approved. That single word did what the entire meeting hadn't. It aligned the room. At 3:49 p.m., legal responded. Terms accepted. Proceeding with documentation. And just like that, the structure reassembled. Not the same. Not as before. Better defined. At 3:50 p.m., access was restored. Permissions unlocked. Systems reconnected. But this time, not invisibly. Every action logged. Every layer acknowledged. At 3:52 p.m., the first correction was applied. Not rushed, not reactive, deliberate. Like someone returning to a system they understood completely, but now on terms that ensured it would never depend on assumption again. At 3:54 p.m., the dashboard stabilized. Not perfectly, but directionally. Enough to stop the spread. Enough to signal control. At 3:56 p.m., finance updated the projection. The $35 million exposure didn't disappear, but it stopped growing. And in that room, that was the difference between loss and containment. No one celebrated, because this wasn't a recovery. It was a recalibration. At 3:58 p.m., the VP finally sat down, slower this time, quieter. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at the structure that had just formed around it. Because for the first time that day, the system made sense again. Not because it was fixed, because it was respected. At 4 p.m., she sent one final message for the day. Stabilization in progress. Full review pending. No extra words. No acknowledgement of what had happened before, because it no longer mattered. What mattered was this. At 2:52 p.m., the room chose a title. At 3 p.m., they lost control. At 3:47 p.m., they understood leverage. At 4 p.m., they paid for it. And this time, no one said a word. Silence.